this is one of 5 ESPTiger Shan Hai mousepads, and in this video we're going to talk about the differences between all of them, of which there are some very subtle and yet distinct ones, whilst attempting to figure out together which one would be for me and why. The Shan Hai series consists of the Chuan Yun, the Lei Ling, the Kun Lun, the Feng Ling and the Tang Dao. Each one measures in at 480 by 400mm in size, comes flat packed, and in what can only be described as some incredibly tasteful packaging. I'm particularly fond of the included plastic cover for storage, and that little calling card is a nice touch as well, to which each details some predetermined measurements relating to their kickoff and in-motion speeds when paired with their own ADDICE mouse gates. Before diving into the different surfaces, you need to know that both pads come in either black or pink. The black version has a diamond pattern anti-slip coating on its base, whilst the pink a mirrored finish. Both types feature a 4mm deep Japanese Poron foam base that does lean more toward medium than it does extra soft in density, but I personally appreciate that for its added consistency during gameplay, and I'd even go as far as to say it's perfect, or at least for me. The mirrored finish is technically the more sticky of the two, giving you that satisfying peel on removal, but neither's going to move on your desk, and it is really just a matter of preference towards surface colour. Edge stitching is flawless on all 5 as well, sitting just below the surface, and is up there with the best in the business. If we were to take the pads at face value, so using those included measurements, or just simply pushing your mouse across the surface, then you'd likely arrange them in the following order. The Tang Dao would be the slowest, followed by the Feng Ling, the Lei Ling, the Kun Lun, and then finally the Chuan Yun. However, it's important to note that all 5 of these pads are ultimately control pads, and if I was to create a scale that starts with the very slow ZOWIE G-SR, ending with the relatively fast Artisan Hien, then they'd all settle somewhere in between, i.e. no pad is too slow nor too fast. On paper this means you really can't go wrong with any of them, regardless of the type of game you play. However, if you watch my previous reviews, then you'll know that for me, how a mousepad interacts with my skin is often just as important as to how it performs with my mouse feet, and usually ends up being the defining factor as to whether I find a pad suitable to main. This is something that's heavily influenced by both your mouse grip and playstyle, or in layman's terms, how much skin contact is made with the surface, and whether you apply pressure during intense situations, but that's something you ought to consider at least when watching reviews. As for what I personally look for in a surface, well that's quite simple. I want a pad that's at least 390mm tall and 450mm wide, and that's so I don't run off the edge at any point, can rest the pad slightly off the desk and put my wrist and arm on it. I also want one that sits somewhere in the slow to medium speed range, that's still soft on my skin, featuring a touch of grain from its weave, as I've typically found that assists with my ability to precisely stop during flicks. It's important to me that I can perform micro adjustments smoothly as well, so I tend to avoid fabric weaves that are either too loose or too tight, as that's typically prevented the sensation of stickiness that would otherwise translate toward bumpy movements. In other words, I like pads similar to the ZOWIE G-SR, LGG Saturn Pro, Spyre Kamek and Xtrfy GP4 Street. All of these pads have allowed me to utilise my somewhat hybrid style grip, transitioning from fingertip, where I apply pressure on the surface with my thumb, ring and pinky for finer adjustments, to more of a claw and palm grip, where I use more of my wrist and arm to track those longer distances. Some days I prefer slower surfaces than others, and I often find it takes me less time to warm up on a slower surface as well, so for consistency reasons, and being able to perform at my best quicker, that's what I typically lean toward when selecting a pad. Starting with the Tang Dao then, both Fresh and AimAdapt have compared it to the Artisan Zero in their videos. Now I've never used that, but I did previously main the QCK, and I'd say it very much resembles that one, so they're probably right. I think this is a great first pad for FPS players though, and features a blended composite fabric with twisted weave, and overall I think it encourages a basic level of mouse control, given that it provides significant resistance on skin contact whilst keeping things snappy for the mouse gates. For me though, I just found that feeling of resistance to be more muggy than it was controlled. It's quite hard to explain, and maybe it's just that I've outgrown QCK inspired pads myself, but even when I'm not sweating, it kind of feels like I'm constantly gaming in a humid environment. To be honest, I don't know if this phenomena will be limited to just me, which is why it's important to watch multiple reviews, and I've also checked with Rain, who's now in the process of reviewing them as well, and he doesn't have that issue either. He mains a Zero and mentions it's a slightly rougher version, but without any of the dust and hair entrapment issues, something that, by the way, I'd hate. Moving on to the Feng Ling, this is in my opinion a ZOWIE G-SR reincarnate. It removes much of the rougher weave of the Tang Dao, so now feels more 2D than 3D, and that's ultimately thanks to its flat woven fibre weave, and a soft one at that. It does leave just a touch of graininess for control, which I like, but ultimately this is its spiritual successor, and with all of its properties combined, it's ultimately the pad that exudes premium quality and feel. If I had to put some arbitrary numbers on it, then it's roughly 5 to 10% faster and softer than the GSR, landing somewhere between both that and a Saturn Pro in speed, but closer to the GSR. It's absolutely a pad I know that many of you are looking for though, and I personally love there's minimal difference in resistance between both my mouse gates and skin, and it's the pad I'd recommend to all levels of FPS players, particularly for those just starting out. It's the safe choice, and for me personally it completely nullifies the Tang Dao. It's simply a better pad in my opinion. The Lei Ling and Kun Lun meanwhile are both jacquard type surfaces, returning to more of a 3D feel, and it's really hard to pick a favourite between the two. In short, the Lei Ling would essentially be the jacquard equivalent of the Feng Ling, but just a little harder and faster, and the Kun Lun would be the same but for the Tang Dao. Both pads do start to exhibit the properties you typically find on more hybrid style surfaces though, which means we're starting to exit tactical shooter territory and aim more exclusively toward arena and arcade, or toward pads you might try after starting with the Feng Ling and deciding you want something faster. I say this because as pads become faster, so does the necessity of having a baseline level of mouse control. That's simply because flicking your mouse around on these surfaces can be so damn fun, and sometimes you really do need to force yourself to slow down. You already know that I prefer the Feng Ling to the Tang Dao, and here again I prefer the Lei Ling to the Kun Lun as well, but unlike the Tang Dao, I don't find the Kun Lun to be muggy. It's just faster on every level, and I prefer to be on the slower side of things. Finally, the Chuan Yun is by far their fastest pad, and it brings us back to a traditional but very tight 2D style weave. Normally this kind of surface, and that's just looking at the weave and shine, would end up being sticky on the skin to me. So I was very surprised to find out this wasn't the case at all. Instead, it feels very silk-like to the touch, and had absolutely no issues whatsoever. Since there's also a little give in the base, thanks to that soft Poron, it also retains a level of control that might not otherwise be possible on a more dense alternative. I think this pad is truly something special, and although I personally prefer a little graininess and a slower surface, there's really nothing quite like this one on the market, so if you want to try a very smooth and very fast pad, it's impossible for me to find fault in its performance, and it could be worth a shot. With all that said though, this pad presents an opportunity to discuss your own approach to testing different peripherals, because it's the only surface here to impact my mouse DPI. So comparing the Chuan Yun with the Feng Ling, Lei Ling and Kun Lun, and moving my death adder V3 from left to right of each mousepad until it stops tracking, results in the same distance travelled in game on all except the Chuan Yun, where there's about a 4% reduction. Now this very well may be within tolerance, but it's just important to mention because if you are changing mouse or pad, it's always good practice to measure your sensitivity. Now I couldn't find any fault in tracking performance, and some shift in DPI between surfaces is expected, but it is something I have to mention nonetheless. So, my final thoughts. While the Shan Hai series from ESPTiger is a prime example of launching a product with just too much choice for the average user. Now don't get me wrong, for those looking for a cloth mousepad, there's absolutely one here for you, and it's just a question of how do you decide which one. Now I've watched 2 reviews of these pads previously, and my impression going into my own testing was that the Tang Dao would probably be the one I'd lean toward as my favourite, given it was mostly being compared to an Artisan Zero and Saturn Pro. As it turns out though, out of all the pads here, it was probably my least favourite, and that's coming from someone that started on the QCK and is currently maining the Saturn Pro. I guess my point is that it's simply hard to know which pad you'll like best without trying them all for yourself. As far as my preferences go, then as you might have guessed, my favourite pad is the Feng Ling. It resembles that GSR and it could quite possibly be described as a 2.0, perhaps more so than ZOWIE's own attempt at a second revision depending on what that's like. If I did want something a little faster, then I'd probably go with the Lei Ling over the Kun Lun, and whilst neither one is as abrasive as many hybrid surfaces on the market, the Lei Ling just adds enough speed without venturing too close to Ghidorah territory, which is where I think the Kun Lun settles, and at that point, it's really hard to compete in both quality and longevity. I do think the Chuan Yun is something special as well, and if you want an unbelievably soft to the touch and yet super fast pad that somehow still manages to retain absolute control, then this is 100% worth a shot. I'm honestly not sure how they managed to pull that surface off, but I almost want to try and use it simply as a commendation. The truth is, beyond the slight difference in sensitivity on the Chuan Yun, I didn't find a performance related issue with any of the pads in their use in game, just minor differences that made the Feng Ling a standout offering for me personally. Pricing is still to be determined for the European region, but I'm told they'll be priced competitively, so if you're in the market for a pad, then I think the Shan Hai series from ESPTiger is something you shouldn't sleep on. Anyway, that about wraps it up. Thanks to ESPTiger for reaching out and sending out the pads, it's very much appreciated. They will be at Gamescom in Germany this August, so if you're still not sure which pad you want and you happen to be heading into Cologne for the weekend, stop by their booth in Hall 10 and get hands-on for yourself. Truth be told, all these pads are brilliant for both tactical and arena type FPS games, and as mentioned, I'd consider all of them to be control, just some being faster than others. If you do want to go ahead and pick one up today, then a good general rule of thumb would be, the heavier your mouse, the faster your pad should be to somewhat counteract that. If you've enjoyed the video though, make sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you like the content, and if you have any questions or comments then make sure you leave them down below and I'll get back to you. I'm planning to main the Feng Ling for the next few weeks too, so feel free to stop by my Twitch stream and ask for my updated thoughts as well. But for now, take care, keep gaming, and I'll see you in the next video.
Revenge. Your flag taken. Impressive. Your flag returned. Defense. Impressive. Your flag. Enemy flag taken. Defense. Combo kill. Defense. Defense. Excellent. Defense. Red wins.
GG.